The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body.
In order to experience the physical and mental health benefits of movement, you do not have to go for a long walk or a run or a movement or dance or yoga for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. You know, if you're in a position where you are struggling to get out of the door at the moment, recognize and understand that just 5 minutes, 10 minutes today, just getting started, just walking around the block, getting out of the door, walking down the road 200 meters, coming back, getting off the bus, a stop early before wherever you're going, and just doing a little bit of walk for those people can make a real meaningful difference.
Hello and a warm welcome back to the podcast. You've just been listening to this episode's special guest, Dr. Brendon Stubbs, who I am delighted to welcome to the show. I have wanted to get Brendon on this show for quite some time, and it was a real honour to finally connect with him and share this conversation and his encyclopedic knowledge on this topic. He has a very unique skill set as a clinical academic physiotherapist, and his primary clinical and research interests are in physical activity and our mental health and well-being, or as he likes to refer to it, the magic of movement for our mind. As is typical with guests on this show, he has a very impressive resume. He is a practising clinician and mental health physiotherapist. He holds a master's in neuro-rehabilitation and a PhD in pain medicine and rehabilitation. He is a world-renowned researcher and authority on this topic and works with international collaborators and has published in over 500 academic papers in leading journals across multiple scientific fields. And we get an opportunity to dig into his encyclopedic knowledge on this topic and some of those research papers and findings in this show. I think even more importantly, as a clinician and researcher, his other primary interest is in the practical translation of research. And that is a topic close to my heart too. We began this podcast speaking to Dr. Brandy Cole about the possible role of our movement and exercise as an adjunctive tool. Essentially, movement can be medicine. And, more recently we spoke to Dr. Adrian O'Neill about, the translation of lifestyle interventions as adjunctive therapy, as prevention, into clinical practice and the challenges with doing robust research. I think the clinical space can be very much an art because of the variabilities of us as humans and of the environments that we work in. But I feel very strongly that where possible, we should be seeking the best quality of evidence available to us. In this episode, Brendon really gets into the evidence behind the role for movement and physical activity as a preventative and also adjunctive treatment for our mental health and well-being. And he also talks about the why movement quite literally changes our brain. I hope you enjoy this conversation on the magic of movement for our mind. Thank you, Brendon, again for making the time in your busy schedule to come on this podcast. I actually became familiar with you and your work while listening to a podcast, quite notably during a run 12 months ago during lockdown. So I was listening to Dr. Rangan Chatterjee's podcast. I'm a big fan of that podcast. And, I was fascinated. I think I was absorbed for that full hour. You couldn't have got me on a topic that was of more interest to me, and I think is very relevant for the podcast that we're creating here. I think by way of introduction, so firstly, thank you. I know that you've had a terrible month or two, and I'm so glad that you're well and making time for this. I really appreciate it. I'd love, by way of introduction, to speak a bit about your own career journey, because you have a really unique niche. You're both a clinician and a researcher, and I'd love to hear about how you started. I've heard a bit of the story, but I think maybe people listening won't know the full story. You became a physiotherapist working uniquely in the mental health space, which I think was quite original at the time, and probably still is actually. And then you've migrated into academia and the research space, and you actually now combine those two areas and passions.
I do, and thanks so much, Cheryl, for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here and we've connected and get opportunities to talk to you and all of your listeners. It's a real pleasure every time, and it's nice that people listen to your podcast and other podcasts, because previously in the past I've been wonderful at sending people to sleep when I talk. I think it's partly due to my voice is just a bit sort of nice and steady. From my early days, but people are genuinely getting interested in the area of movement and mental health, which is great. So less people are falling asleep when I talk now, which is a positive.
I was absorbed.
But that's good. So I wish I could say I set out with. Well, I don't wish I could say I'm very happy with how it turned out, but I can't say that I set out with a really noble or passion to work in mental health. Because it would be an outright lie. I've always been interested in mental health. I chose a module on mental health and physiotherapy training, which was in the early 2000s, in the year 2000, and that was quite rare then, and it's still quite rare now to have a mental specific module, which is really quite strange to me when we consider the mind and body being interconnected. And so I was really interested in it in terms of the mind and body interaction and mental health more broadly. But I didn't intend on going the path that I've gone. It's all been a series of veering off track and just pleasantly being surprised by what I found. And I'll give a condensed overview of how I got to where I am now. And so I did my physio training, and to be honest, I was a bit indifferent about many of the different areas that I've worked in, and like any areas of health care professionals, worked in lots of different areas like stroke rehab. I worked in traditional musculoskeletal areas, or helping people with respiratory breathing conditions. And I liked all of them, but I was not grabbed by any single one. And to the point where I was always thinking, do I really want to do this? And then I finished university, and my mum worked as a head pharmacist at a local psychiatric hospital, a big psychiatric hospital. And really, just to please her, she just said, "Brendon, will you go and talk to the head of physio at that particular time?" So just to kind of get my mum off my back, I said, sure, mum, yeah, I'll go. I'd graduated, I'd just turned 20.
Yep.
And I just went, I was like, of course, yeah, I'll go and talk to her. And then kind of just very informally as it was those days, met the head of physio, and she was like, it was the first time they'd ever employed someone who was newly qualified as I was then, and it was quite new for them, and it was obviously new for me because everybody in physiotherapy did a very traditional role, going in and doing lots of rotations, and I gave it a go, and I worked in a mental health hospital for a couple of years, and I really enjoyed it, and I found it so fascinating and interesting. The people, the characters, the engagement, the relationship building, the time you got to work with people, and just the whole focus on, not just someone coming in with a sore knee, not just someone coming in with some neurological deficit or difficulty moving their arm. It was just a whole team working together, looking at the whole person, mind and body interconnected. Yeah. And what I really liked was the whole team was just, completely equal with the person at the center, and we were all like working together with people who'd had some difficult circumstances. We were all like, how can we put this person at the forefront and make them better? So it was a really positive and interesting and fascinating experience and a steep learning curve. And it's fair to say I was hooked from the offset from that. And then subsequently, I did some more traditional physio things. I went to go and work in general hospitals, and I did some sports physiotherapy and some of the more quote unquote traditional physiotherapy type stuff. But I kept getting not dragged back, but I kept ending up back in mental health services. And I've worked in a range of different capacities as a mental health clinician. I still work as a mental health clinician. And it's just my home really at work.
I'm curious, in those early days, you wouldn't have been a textbook of mental health physiotherapy. How did you kind of embrace that as a new role and a relatively junior physiotherapist yourself in terms of what you actually did with people back then? I know you've written guidelines today, many years later.
No, well, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And in many ways, I was much more, wrongly confident than I am now. Much more now when I work with people, even though I've published a good number of papers and written guidelines, I'm much less certain and I'm much less, cautious and walk with the person and then, being a newly qualified person, I thought I knew quite a lot. But I remember clearly one of the sort of later on, there's a couple of years later, which exemplifies this point quite well. It was kind of like a sink or swim moment. I started working in a mental health hospital for people with Huntington's disease. It was a unit I was working on a few days a week, which is a rare genetic condition which can affect really young people across the age span. And people present with quite profound motor and neurological deficits, and many people have neuropsychiatric and mental health components as well. So this was a completely new world to me in sort of 2005. And I remember then having, trying to look out and say, what do I do? I had all of these people with these really complex, very different, very heterogeneous presentations and really quite profound, and thinking, sugar, I'm here. And at that point, I was a senior physio on my own. People coming to me and saying, what should we do? And I just, I'm not sure if Google was around then, but I did my best to try and find some evidence. And there was literally nothing in 2005 around published papers or articles. I think I found a few book chapters. So I very quickly thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And then it was kind of quickly supplanted by, perhaps this is an opportunity to do something about this population, which were in such great need for physical and mental and mind-body care, and a real key role for physiotherapy in helping people move, increasing independence. And then I just started out by writing, encouraged by some colleagues to do some guidelines for people with the condition of Huntington's disease about what physiotherapy may be able to offer and help them. And also, families and caregivers. And it wasn't academic. It was aimed at individuals with the condition. It was aimed at people in their families, and it was mainly around physiotherapy and what physiotherapy can offer in this context, physical and mental health. And that was sort of kind of like a sink or swim moment for me, because there was no evidence generally, but particularly in that particular condition. And I suppose that started my interest in writing in academia. And I thought there's a real potential here to write about some really interesting things. We've seen some enormous, wonderful people who are so fascinating and interesting that I just thought I cannot not write about this to help other people, because I'm on a unit with all of these people, and there must be lots of other people who maybe see one or two of these people in their career and do something about it. So that kind of got me started. So it's a sink or swim moment, and I think that's kind of how I've carried on since then.
And how did you nudge from there into a more wider research remit? Was that opportunity or something you actively pursued?
It was opportunity. Again, I wish I could say I set out to be a good researcher or do all of this. Absolutely not. I left university in honesty and thought I never want to study again. I never want to write anything again. And that's the honest truth. And now, a big part of my role is in the university and writing lots. And but that's the honest truth. So I can't come out and say I set out with this great plan to write lots of research papers.
I think there's plenty of people listening who'll be quite reassured by that, actually.
So it was a pleasant accident. Again, just compelled by circumstances. In this instance, something very simple, and then it moved on to other areas. I noticed, a couple of years later, I noticed lots of things. I was watching what was happening in practice in the early 2000s in mental health services as a physio, and primarily trained in physical health. And times have changed, but people were at those times were still like smoking on the wards.
Yeah.
Were eating terrible food, being served terrible food. The only time people would often go off the ward was for a cigarette break, often, and then people were just sitting around, not engaging in much activity, and putting on lots of weight for a complex, different range of reasons. And for me and my training and my sort of interests, I just thought, we've got to do something about this. So I did something really simple to start me off on my sort of main area of research, and very, very simple. And we ended up writing up an audit paper on this. And essentially all we did, myself, a psychologist, and a couple of assistant psychologists, is we did some education sessions I was working in older adult inpatient mental health, and particularly a couple of secure forensic units. So these are people with severe and injury or mental ill health who have entered the criminal justice system and are unwell and need to be cared for in a hospital. There were certain restrictions on people in that particular environment that predisposed them to being inactive and gaining weight and several other things. And what we did at that particular stage was just really simple. We sat down and had some interactive sessions over the course of a week about the benefits of an active lifestyle. What could be some common barriers, facilitators, how many people have opportunities to do that. And we gave people pedometers at that particular time, and put on a chart at on the ward, and people that wanted to take part, sort of wrote their name on, and it's really nice coming at the end of the days with come and see people, and you see a line of the patients getting up and writing up their scores and how many steps they've done on that day, and we did that and measured that, and we did that for a few weeks and wrote up the results of just what can happen with these brief, educational, interactive type sessions for people who may not have the opportunity to be active or may not have the knowledge or power, and setting people goals. We talked about goal setting and that type of thing, and it was just that was kind of the start into my sort of action and writing into this particular area.
What was the outcome of that first audit study, looking at brief motivational tools and education? What did you find?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'll answer it how I view it now, but with reference, at that time I know a bit more about research, and I'm much more cautious about how I present things now.
Yeah, fair enough.
But what we found is people increase their physical activity. People really enjoy taking part overall. I think everybody signed up on the board every night. It was like a hobby project. I didn't have any predicted research time. And I'd go in at the end of the early evening, and people writing up their score. People liked this sense of community. People didn't have much autonomy around their behaviours and what they could do, or feel they could make changes on a daily basis to improve their health and well-being. And this really empowered people. And we did find that people who took part, compared to what they where they were doing at the baseline, became more active. And because it was so long ago, and my memory's bad, and I've done other stuff since, I can't remember exactly by how much, but people started walking more, and people found it really beneficial, and it changed staff culture as well, because we engaged staff on the ward in these sort of educational sessions about the benefits of an active lifestyle. And, traditionally at that stage in the early 2000s, it's a case of let's get everyone in inpatient sitting down, keep everyone observed, everyone nice and settled. And, just so everything's nice and sort of calm. But, I was going in and said, let's get everyone up, let's get everyone moving, let's get everyone out. And let's not just make it about, let's take them out for a cigarette break. And so I think it helped change staff attitudes. We didn't measure that. That's my retrospective bias, and maybe a bit of a romantic bias on my behalf.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of like the crux of what we found.
Still important lessons that even I think, 15 years on, you would probably say that there were pearls in that early study that would translate today. And look, I mean, I know that you're one of the most prominent researchers globally now in the area of movement and our mental well-being and mind. Look, we've spoken many times on this podcast about the mental health benefits of exercise and movement. And many of my guests have shared personal journeys of mental ill health and the role that sport and exercise has played in their recovery and their maintenance. I'm a runner, and, I'm very conscious that, many of us run as much for our mental as our physical health. But I'm also quite aware of the power of the kind of community and connection that I get through my running. I know that you have now all of this research knowledge, and it's probably difficult to make it succinct, but what do we actually know about this? Why is exercise such a powerful tool for our mental well-being? I've heard you talk recently about some commentary on the runner's high, and I know there's probably a bit of misnomer and misconception around that. So I'd love if you could summarize. Now I appreciate that's 2 decades of work, and tell us what we actually know today.
Sure. Great questions, Cheryl. So I'll distill it into 3 areas that we know about science. And I'll talk very much about data, evidence, and what we do and what we don't know around this. So we've got really good evidence now, and we've, to say that movement, physical activity, moving around in our daily lives, running, resistance training, any type of movement that gets our body moving. When we look at people over long periods of time, people who engage in high levels of movement maintain better well-being in the future. So we've demonstrated, us and many other colleagues have demonstrated, it's very protective of keeping people happy when we follow people longitudinally. And within this prevention component, which I'd first like to talk about, we've also demonstrated that for people who are free from a mental health condition at baseline, such as anxiety or depression, that being more active can protect you years later from developing a mental health condition. Looking at big, large data sets. So one of the big studies we did in 2018 was in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and we looked at 260,000 people. It was a complex and difficult study to do, but the question was really effectively very simple. We wanted to understand in non-depressed people all over the world, when you look at how much activity are people doing in their daily lives, and you account for other things as best as you can within statistical models and people's lives, such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, physical health conditions people may have, and people are not depressed at baseline. What happens when you look at their daily activity and you visit these people again 7.5 years later and you have a formal assessment for depression? Mm-hmm. And so we're just looking at this direction, prevention. And we found that people who are most active were around 15 to 20% less likely to develop depression in the future when you adjusted for as many things as possible. But that was most sort of potent or effective when people met 150 minutes of moderate or vigorous intensity physical activity over the course of the week, around a 30% reduced risk or odds of depression. We've shown a similar thing in anxiety disorders. Philippe Shook has been the first author of both of these papers, including post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. So we've shown consistently, longitudinally, the more active you are, the less likely you are to develop a mental health condition and promote better mental well-being in the future. I would really like to caveat that with, for anyone who's experienced, knows anybody who's had difficulties or challenges in their mental well-being or had a mental health condition. Of course, many of us have had, many of us know people at this moment in time. It's a very complex and multifaceted area, but this is looking at big data sets of people and showing what can we do when we look at large numbers of people. So the first paper I mentioned looked at 260,000 people. So I don't want to distill this message into, if you keep on running forever, you're always going to be happy and healthy, because of course not, stuff happens. But at a population level and at an individual level, we've shown prevention is key. And there's one other study I'll just briefly mention on the power of prevention for movement to protect our mental health. There was a couple of really nice genetic Mendelian randomization studies done by Carmel Choi, who used to be where I work at the Institute of Psychiatry, and now she's based at Harvard University. And she used data from the UK Biobank. And Mendelian randomization studies, they're not my area of expertise, but I have a limited grasp of these. And they're in effect looking at the relationship between an outcome such as depression and an exposure, physical activity in this instance, and a genetic makeup, and it can prove whether there is a causal link. And what Carmel Choi and colleagues have done using UK Biobank data from over 100,000 people, using device-measured, objective, accelerometry derived physical activity data. So we're not talking about some of the commercially available devices which have variable accuracy. We're talking about good standard measurement of physical activity in over 100,000 people. She's demonstrated in a really neat way that there is a causal link between moving more and protecting yourself from depression in the future. And she's even done a subset analysis of paper and depression and anxiety, looking at recognizing that depression, there is a genetic component for some aspects of it. Not everyone who has those genes will go on to develop depression, but there are some genes that are associated with depression. So what she did was something really nice, and she looked at, when you look at people who are genetically predisposed and have these genes associated with depression, and you split them into groups that do enough physical activity, 150 minutes, versus those that don't, she found that if you're both equally weighted, again, big numbers of people, this is not people self-reporting data, objective data.
Yeah.
She's shown that even if you're genetically predisposed, but you're active in your daily life, you can offset your genetic risk compared to people who have the same genetic risk profile, who are predisposed to developing depression and are inactive. So that really goes to feed into the story. We've shown longitudinally it helps keeps you healthy, happy, and protect against mental health conditions. Other people such as her have gone on saying there's a causal link and a genetic link, which really advances the first area. I know I said it'd be succinct, but I've only covered one area.
No, it's fascinating.
So there's two more areas I'd like to cover. So prevention, we've demonstrated longitudinally, genetically, movement is good for promoting mental health. The other key area is the actual treatment of adverse mental well-being, if we can use that term, or people who have mental health symptoms of a condition such as anxiety, worry, low mood, or if people having a condition such as a generalized anxiety disorder or clinical depression, or even more, I don't like to use the term, but it's a term that we use, serious mental health condition, such as schizophrenia. And generally, the evidence has shown across all of these individual conditions that if you add on exercise, whether it be aerobic, getting your heart up and running, resistance-based training, emerging evidence around yoga, Pilates, you can improve people's mental health for those conditions, and also improve quality of life and other physical health metrics in randomized controlled trial evidence. And this is getting a bit geeky now, but essentially randomized controlled trial evidence is the sort of gold standard to say whether something does or doesn't work and works as an actual treatment. And there's been quite a lot of research over the past 10, 20 years, which is, pretty strongly suggested that as an add-on treatment for anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, to a lesser extent emerging, we can improve people's mental health, physical health, quality of life, and various other factors. And it's important to say that for all of those conditions, there are other treatment options that are available as well, whether it be It could be a medication that'd be really appropriate for some people. It could be some talking therapies for some people. But now what we've done, and other people have brought to the table and saying that exercise is a really viable option for people to consider as an actual treatment for these conditions, particularly at the mild to moderate spectrum. And before I move on to the third area, I'm going to want to highlight one study, particularly because I think this study really addresses some of the criticisms, not criticisms, but fair points which people make about, does exercise really improve people's mental health, and how good is it? One of the main criticisms in the most commonly studied area is exercise and depression is that studies have been not very long term in follow-up, 3 months, 6 months at max. And in research and in life, if we're going to look at if people get well, we like longer term follow-up trials for people. Many antidepressant trials are equal, length of 3 months, 6 months. Many CBT trials are of a similar nature, but longer term gives you a better indication of what's happening to people in the long run. So that was one of the main areas of concern. Another area of concern was that people were, many of the studies weren't large in terms of the number of people which are included in the randomized control trials. And in research, to make changes in practice and to say that this worked convincingly, we like to say that there's large numbers of people in randomized control trials. So those are some of the two key areas of criticism of exercise in depression. Yeah. And Mats Holmgren at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden did a really nice study in 2016. And he did something really fascinating which addressed many of the criticisms which have gone on previously. And it was the Regassa study. And essentially what Mats Holmgren and colleagues did is they looked at people in the community who had mild to moderate depression and recruited over 900 people living in the community who had confirmed mild to moderate depression. Mm-hmm. Everybody received standard care, so there was no difference between all of the people included in the study. So whatever their GP or physician or psychiatrist recommended them, they all got exactly that. And then randomly they were allocated into 3 groups and followed up for 12 months, so addressing the long-term issue. So over 300 people in each arm, which is big numbers, which we like in research, 12 months follow-up, which addresses many of the claims. And one group carried on as usual, just had usual care, what would happen in Sweden, which is good practice. And they followed those people up, 300 people for 12 months. The second group had CBT, again, a recognised internationally valid method to help people who are struggling with low mood, delivered via the internet. The third group had exercise for a total of 24 weeks, and they were followed up for 12 months. And what Mats Holmgren and colleagues found in this paper's in the British Journal of Psychiatry is they demonstrated that the treatment as usual group slightly improved, but the CBT and the exercise group significantly, and that means it didn't happen by chance, and clinically improved much more than the treatment as usual group. So they were both better than usual care in the treatment of mild to moderate depression in the community. But interestingly, there was no difference between CBT and exercise for the treatment of depression. And what that really sort of demonstrates is that they're both equally effective, for treating depression. This is large numbers, long-term follow-up, and it really just puts exercise in a place where we can say, we routinely may recommend, if various things have happened, that people may take an antidepressant, but we routinely recommend talking therapies. That's widely accepted amongst medical practitioners and everyone else. But this study is showing is that exercise is equally as effective, as CBT for the treatment of that. And then when we consider all of the other benefits of exercise, when we talk about physical health benefits, mental health benefits, feeling of sense of purpose, of achieving a goal, and getting out, and you mentioned at the start, sense of social connection which you get from perhaps running in a group and everything else, the potential benefits are exponential beyond looking at depressive symptoms too. So That's rounding off my area number 2. I'm trying to be as succinct as possible.
No, it's great. It's so powerful. I remember when I was a medical student, I did an intercalated in sports medicine, and we looked at some of that. It would have been the same vintage as you. So it would have been about that early time when some of those initial intervention studies in depression were taking place. And I remember the graphs with the CBT and the medication, and the powerful adjunctive effect of exercise from those small studies. So it's so nice to see the evolution of that research in big numbers, gold standard randomized controlled trials. So fantastic.
The other really area, and I'm distilling this, is why is the emerging area. So we've shown prevention, we've shown treatment as a viable option for some people and bringing as many to the table. The other area, which is really exciting, is why. Why does exercise make us feel good? What's happening? What are the mechanisms? What are the psychosocial mechanisms? What are the neurobiological mechanisms that are going on? And this is a really new and emerging area. People, and you alluded to this at the start, had a theory for a very long period of time about it makes me feel good because of, one of the things about runner's high, as an example, is it releases endorphins. People have had, all manner of different theories. But really, again, within the last sort of 10, 15 years, have we started to get good evidence. Most of what we know previously has been based on people's theoretical frameworks or lab-based work. And by lab-based work, I predominantly mean working in non-human models of work. So what can I briefly summarize about what we know and what we don't know? I'll caveat this by saying that maybe you'll find a guest that knows more than me about this. But I will say that we don't know a lot about why exercise makes us feel good, but we're learning much more. But what we do realize is that it's a really complex, multifaceted, system, as we are humans, in terms of our bodies and the interactions that go on and all of the different systems that are at work. Yeah. And I'll try and distill this into, 2 core clusters of areas. So clearly, whenever we exercise, and I'm talking more generally in the context of improving mental well-being and mental health conditions, is there's a number of neurobiological mechanisms which are at play whenever we exercise. So, for instance, as soon as we start to move, our brains are living organisms, and we get interconnectivity between key parts within our brain, which account for processing of our memories, help us feel more attentive, alert. And, that happens within, very short periods of time of going out for running within the brain. And, key areas such as the prefrontal cortex, processing of emotions, or the hippocampus can change within, light amounts of activity within very short periods of time. So there's key changes which happen within the brain as soon as we start to move and engage, just as there are changes happening with you and I, or your listeners are listening to this now. Our brains are living organisms which are changing, and we have real-time changes that happen in our brain. Exercise impacts that. Key emotional processing areas. We're particularly excited about the area called the hippocampus, particularly excited about total volume of the brain and number of brain cells and the prefrontal cortex. And that can change in the short term, but we and others have shown that also within the longer term, so within sort of 10 to 12 weeks, you can get actual volume changes in key areas of the brain called like the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex. So we did a paper in Neuro-Image, which is a journal, and I think 2019, and shown that in healthy and in clinical populations, so if you get people engaging in aerobic-based exercise, you can increase actual people's hippocampus volume. And why is that important? The hippocampus is a really important structure within the deep midbrain. If you look at what happens in conditions such as dementia, mild cognitive impairment, schizophrenia, depression, you name it across these mental cognitive disorders, one consistency is this area of the brain, hippocampus, is reduced. And what we've shown in randomized controlled trials I'm talking about here, in volume change in 10 to 12 weeks, is that you can get changes in your hippocampus. But that can happen within a 10-minute, 20-minute run in terms of actual changes in circulation and activity. And also within adolescents, we did a study with some colleagues in China looking in adolescents and showing that you can get changes again within the hippocampus and electrical activity there, but also the prefrontal cortex within a randomized controlled trial within young children in the context of school who were presenting with sub-threshold mood symptoms. They were starting to feel, they didn't have a diagnosis of depression or bipolar disorder, but it was starting to present the symptoms of low mood. So that is one of the areas, if we just focus on the brain and what may be one of the mechanisms amongst many, and I could fill the rest of the time talking about this, but I don't want to. I'll refer to a paper which can make much more concise sense than I can in the podcast. We've shown again in randomized controlled trials with colleagues in Germany is that with aerobic and resistance exercise you can get increases in improving people's depression, but also improving brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, compared to the control condition. So this is, randomized controlled causal evidence, and BDNF is, your brain fertilizer, which really sort of goes out and stimulates brain processing and regrowth and regeneration of new cells within your brain. So it's pretty important. And I'll touch upon a couple of other neurobiological mechanisms as well, very briefly, and then talk about the endorphin issue. So other areas, just briefly, are, recent research has shown, built on that the endocannabinoid system is particularly important for running and the reward processing system. And increasing research is suggesting that this is, perhaps a mechanism which accounts for the quote-unquote runners high, one of the key mechanisms. And it's not the release of endorphins, which actually have quite a lot of difficulty crossing the blood-brain barrier. And really making an impact on us. Endorphins do change when we exercise, but it's probably due to the endocannabinoid system. We also get changes in other chemicals such as serotonin and a variety of other factors which have been implicated or noticed to be changed in people who have mental health conditions such as depression. The last thing I will say about neurobiological mechanisms is that if we look at people with depression, and we have done this, and we've shown when you get a group of people with depression and you compare their peripheral inflammatory profile, and by that I mean markers of inflammation such as C-reactive protein, interleukin 2, 4, 6, tumor necrosis factor, these indicators of some sort of heightened sense of alertness or stress. This is elevated, in this mental health symptom within the body and the circulating blood of people with depression versus controls. And we know that exercise and movement is a very powerful, up to a point, anti-inflammatory component and reducing stress. So that is probably one of the other neurobiological mechanisms. And you can just see, by me just talking, I don't know, for the past 3 or 4 minutes, that, unless somebody tells me otherwise, for anyone who says exercise makes me feel good or exercise works because of chemical X or pathway Y, they're really smart and they know a lot more than me, but you can just see how complex it is. We just consider neurobiological mechanisms. I mean, I've briefly touched upon this. I'll touch briefly upon the biopsychosocial mechanisms as well. It's really important to consider those. I mean, I've been for a run this morning, a very small, gentle run, and this is reflected in the evidence. If we run, we feel a sense of achievement. We feel satisfied with ourselves. In the normal times, if we're running as part of a group, perhaps with a friend, we feel a sense of connection. I've been outdoors for my run, and we feel a sense of connection with nature. That peace and mindfulness which you can bring within yourself as well, and improve your self-esteem, self-confidence. So all of these, biopsychosocial mechanisms intersect with, our experiences in the environment, which I've mentioned, and these internal processes which are happening in real time within our brain, in real time within our bodies, and upstream as well. So that is a brief framework and a really nice paper that summarises this is a wonderful future star PhD student, led by 2 PhD students. The first author is Aaron Candola, and the paper is looking at the antidepressant effects of exercise. But it's a good framework to try and conceptualize what we know about this evidence area and looking at the inter and cross-sectionality between all of these components. And it's a neuroscience and biobehavioral reviews.
Thank you so much, Brendon, for that fantastic overview. I find your knowledge around this subject mind-blowing. And I think particularly with that last section on the why, I think a take-home for me is that exercise and physical activity can quite literally change our brains. But the complexity of the mechanisms actually underpinning and driving this, and how we actually study neurobiological and psychosocial factors and how much they influence the process is very challenging. We are highly complex creatures, and I think I spoke about the challenges and barriers to actually studying lifestyle medicine and intervention in this respect with Adrian O'Neill a few episodes ago. And she was talking about the challenges with recruitment for the SMILES trial and, potential barriers if you're suffering from moderate depression to actually become involved in a study. Particularly it was a nutritional intervention in this instance. And I'd love if you could speak about some of the challenges that you have come across in your research and the barriers that people with mental ill health might have in actually becoming involved in recruitment studies.
Yeah, it is. It is surprisingly because taking part in a research study is certainly across different areas. Is you don't just turn up and say I want to take part in a research study, and you turn up on one day and you engage in some healthy eating or some exercise and stuff. It's quite a rigorous process to go through in terms of understanding the study, signing up the consent form as an individual, then actually engaging in the program. So it's quite a commitment. And the areas I work in, it's people who are not feeling great in themselves anyway. So if you're not feeling great, it's difficult to commit and to stay and continue to want to engage in things. So it's recruitment into research and also keeping people interested and enjoying taking part is always a challenge. But I also find that I'm always pleasantly surprised by once people get started, even in the most severe end of the spectrum. And not say all mental health conditions can be serious, but it's just the terminology we use. So people with schizophrenia, for example, who are often really profoundly affected by mental health symptoms, which disrupts their daily lives. Once people get started and really enjoy it and really sort of dedicate themselves to the exercise or the trial, and which is just amazing. And the work that I have done in people who do not have a recognised mental health condition, it may be looking at a lifestyle approach to people to improve their mental well-being, so just general people. We all have mental health and mental well-being, and in search for mental health is I'm always struck, and I understand why people are so people are naturally disappointed when they get allocated into the control group.
Yeah, interesting.
Which is always a challenge because people want to take part in the study because they want to be part of the intervention. And that always strikes me.
And I really want to go on to talk about the translation of evidence into practice, because I know that is a prime focus for you and that you're also ideally placed to do this, and as both clinician and researcher. But before we do that, I wanted to pick up on something from that last segment, because it did make me think. I've been listening to you talking about some research studies from a few years ago that, I think would be of questionable ethics, probably today, given what we know, but also very interesting given where we find ourselves in the world right now in the midst of a global pandemic where people have had restrictions placed on their movements through periods of lockdown. And I do think there is this dichotomy of people who have done more and people who have done less than they would have otherwise. But it was studies looking at enforced sedentary behaviour in young adults. And so they had a group that, were encouraged to do less activity than they would have normally. And it then looked, in the kind of immediate and short term at the effect and the impact of that on their mental health and well-being, with quite notable deterioration, which, I find important and fascinating, because I think we are, certainly anecdotally and from my own kind of subjective experience, seeing that play out in real time. So I wondered if you had any commentary around that.
Yeah, no, sure. So there was two studies, one 2015, one 2016, and they were randomized controlled trial studies. And normally when we do a study, we do something helpful, like we give people exercise, we give people a talking therapy, we may give people a medication if it's indicated. But what both of these studies did over a short period of time, one was 1 week, one was 4 weeks. And what they did is they looked in a randomized control trial of people, and they randomized one group to carry on doing normal. And these are all people in their early 20s that were screened for no mental or physical health comorbidity, and they tracked their mental health symptoms. And the other group were told to sit still, be more sedentary, and do not move. So this was way before pre-COVID time. So it was kind of like enforced sedentary behaviour amongst people, and telling people don't move who were previously quite active. And what the first study found was over a week that there was a profound notable deterioration in people's mental health after just 1 week of this enforced sedentary behaviour. So when you relay that back into what does that mean in the context of the good reasons we've all been told to stay safe and not move around as much for lots of reasons, you can quickly see how this could have an impact on the mental health, forgetting all of the other sort of stresses that have been going on as a result of this. But what they did find is once the condition was stopped after a week and people had to carry on with their usual routine, thankfully people bounced back very quickly and their mental health returned back to where it was a baseline. Right. But it really demonstrates that just a week of inactivity, and you think, in the context of outside of this, an injury, an illness, something else. And it's important we rest in those periods of time as well. Of course it is, but just that week, you can notice a deterioration in people's mental health. And the other study was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and Mark Hamer was the senior author, and they did the same thing, a randomized controlled trial, and people were told to be sedentary for 4 weeks. So it's a longer study, and they looked to see what is the psychobiological reason that is accounting for this change. They didn't know what was going to change in terms of people's mood and stress. They found the same thing. They found over 4 weeks, young people in their early 20s, no mental and physical health comorbidity, who were previously active. If you enforce sedentary behaviour, people start to become stressed and anxious. And they elucidated, found out that it was probably due to changes in inflammation markers. So genuine biological changes were happening in this group of quote unquote healthy people over a short period of time. And that really goes to build onto the story which I referenced earlier. If we look at people who have a mental health condition such as depression versus people who don't, there is this consistently raised inflammatory profile. Here, these randomized control trials are saying over a short period of time, you can make people feel worse and you can get people to, their bodies to become more inflamed. So those are some of the key findings and synopsis of those.
Yeah, thanks. I found those studies fascinating, and it's powerful given where we are in the world and what we've been experiencing through this past year. I think it's reassuring that certainly in the studies there was reversible effects found, particularly in the shorter term. So I wanted to go on to talk about the translation of research into practice, because, I think the vast majority of us know that physical activity and movement and exercise is good for our health, mind and body. But it's the actual doing And, I don't actually speak for myself here because, I read Kelly McGonigal's The Joy of Movement a couple of years ago, and she talks about her own relationship with movement and how even from a young age, she knew that movement brought her joy and she felt good, and she's never really found it hard to bring herself to move and exercise, and her experience was very similar to my own. I think I was conscious. I danced a lot when I was younger. I was always involved in some kind of organised physical activity. I would teach the dancing and the aerobics, and I knew that I felt good when I moved my body. And I don't find it that hard to motivate myself to move, to run. I obviously do a lot of running, but I'm conscious that not everyone feels like that. And certainly my mum would speak to that. I think the thought of movement and physical activity, and certainly any organised exercise, is quite off-putting on most days to her. But she, or if she heads out into the garden for a couple of hours, she feels good afterwards. But it's the actual taking the step out the door, taking the step to do the gardening, that is the challenging part. And I'd love, I know there's a bit of research in lifestyle medicine about both motivational tools and intervention. And I'd love if you could share some of your experience practically working with your patients, your clients, and share some of the pearls. Because I think we probably need to reframe, the conversation around exercise and physical activity. If 30 minutes of moderate activity is recommended by the WHO for optimum health, I certainly tell people that could be 3 10-minute sessions through the day, and that might just be taking an extra flight of stairs. That might be, doing some vigorous housework even, or dancing, around the room with your hairbrush, which I have been known to do. But I'd love to know if there's any research, I think meta research is the term for it, where you're actually looking at how we encourage and motivate people to do things that ultimately will make them feel good.
So I'll, I think the word just generally exercise, and I'm really pleased that the whole conversation has been reframed about movement and, finding things that you enjoy, because, the word exercise, whether we do or don't like it, it is describing a certain subset of physical activity, and it naturally brings up a lot of negative connotations for some people who can have negative experiences at, PE at school, for instance, or think to experience the benefits of movement, you have to go out and run a half marathon or a 5K, or you have to go to the gym. And some people may love that, but for some people, not everyone's had a positive experience. So the whole reframing of this, continuously talked about the joys of movement, or the magic of movement. We're calling it long, for several years. We've talked about the magic of movement, and I think it's really important, because it's really about finding a movement that you enjoy, and you're moving your body, and that will have benefits. That can be gardening, that can be dancing, that can be going for a run if you enjoy a run. That can be going for a walk if you enjoy a walk. That can be going to the gym. The key thing for any long-term behaviour change is finding something you enjoy, you find pleasure in. And in many ways, for people who struggle to find a movement they enjoy, or don't find it difficult, or may struggle for mental health reasons or physical health reasons, because it's painful or it's difficult or it's challenging, disguising that in a way so it doesn't really feel like exercising. You're sort of, walking and talking and socialising and not really thinking about the movement is a really good way. So I think that's really, really powerful. Long-term research has shown, in order to keep this not just like a short-term fad, like attending an exercise class for like 12 weeks, or doing an exercise program for 12 weeks to get ready for an event, that finding pleasure, the magic of movement is really, really key. And self-selecting that pace is really, really important as well. So just forget what everyone else is doing. If you do go to a gym, forget if you're running, just forget what everyone else is doing. Go at your pace, because research consistently shown quite convincingly that people who self-select their movement at their own pace are much more likely to find enjoyment and do this for the long term, which is what we want with any, healthy behaviour change, and we want people to be having fun long term. So, how do we help encourage people who, are not interested? And this is, a difficult area and a difficult question to get started. And I think it comes back again to the messaging and again to reference to the guidelines and the evidence. And I'll reflect a bit on my own clinical and personal experience of talking to friends and family, people who struggle with their mental health, physical health, and also my own clinical work, and also for myself as well, is that in order to experience the physical and mental health benefits of movement, you do not have to go for a long walk or a run or a movement or dance or yoga for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. If you're in a position where you are struggling to get out of the door at the moment, recognize and understand that just 5 minutes, 10 minutes today, just getting started, just walking around the block, getting out the door, walking down the road 200 meters, coming back, getting off the bus, a stop early before wherever you're going, and just doing a little bit of walk for those people can make a real meaningful difference. Not only in terms of having mental and physical health impact, but feeling a sense of achievement and purpose today. I got off the bus stop early, or I may look at my watch on my phone and see today, yesterday I did 200 steps. Today I've done 250. Wow, I've done that. So that is really important, because guidelines or recommendations can put a lot of people off. And it's empowering people, just get started. Don't worry what anyone else is doing. Don't worry what guidelines is doing. Just get started. Do something you enjoy. If you try and do something which is, too hard, too difficult, your friends really like, but you don't like, you're quickly going to stop doing it. So that would be good. And then once you've experienced the benefits and that you can do it, then you can slowly, incrementally increase it. So if you are very sedentary for any one number of reasons and you do 200 steps a day on average, and the next day you do 220 or 250, then you can think, wow, I am able to make a change today on the amount of steps that I'm doing it, and that is progress. You will have longer term physical, mental health benefits from that. And then the next day you can try and do the same. And then the next day you can do the same. And then the next day you can maybe just edge up, a tiny bit more. And, this small changes, getting started, tracking, not getting obsessed with numbers, but recognizing that we can incrementally increase is really, really important within the context of recognizing that movement can mean lots of things to different people. So find a movement you enjoy, give it a go, start off small, build up from there, and experience the benefits. And if you are really struggling, or you find it difficult, or just don't want to for any one number of reasons, then disguise it or go for something with a friend. Have a purpose to get out and to move. Whether it be for coffee, going for a walk with a friend, going to sit and observe a nice piece of nature in the land if you around you if you can. And for those people who are really struggling, that can be really beneficial, I've found.
Yeah, thanks, Brendon. Really practical top tips there. I've said that I love movement and physical activity, but I am an all or nothing person, and I think many of us can identify with that. Well, if we can't, go out and do X amount of movement or exercise, then we'd be as well just staying on the couch. And the importance of just doing something and start small and incrementally is and make it fun, make it something you enjoy. Involve your friends, add community, add nature. Yeah, I think these are all gold. And just on that, because we have spoken about the World Health Organization recommendations for physical activity and health. And so those would be, for example, for adults, 30 minutes when we're talking about aerobic activity, of 30 minutes of moderate exercise or movement on most days of the week, or a couple of sessions of 75-minute sessions of more vigorous activity, and incorporating 2 resistance or strength sessions. Are those based mainly on our physical health? Because, certainly from what you have alluded to here, based on the research, much less than that can confer mental health benefits. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a great point, Cheryl, and it's good that you're bringing this up now, because the World Health Organization updated their guidelines about 2 or 3 months ago, and some really important changes have happened. So I'm going to start off with the scary bit, and then make you realise that it's not scary, and it's very heavily caveated.
Yeah.
So the World Health Organization are recommending that adults, and I don't like to use the word term because I'm not sure anyone can agree what a quote unquote healthy adult is.
Yeah.
But for most people, should try over the course of the week to aim to have 150, now up to 300 minutes of moderate and vigorous exercise over the course of a week. And that's a scary number for most people. It's a scary number for me. It's a lot. It's a lot of movement. And previously, we just focused on 150 minutes. We knew that 50 to 70% of people do not meet recommended guidelines. Yeah. But the evidence is accumulating that you continue to get mental health and physical health benefits up to sort of 300 minutes. They can say that. Previously, it's all been based on physical health. And for the first time, the World Health Organization made reference to the mental health benefits of movement too, and citing many of ours and other people's work to say that, not only should we be moving to help us live longer and reduce the risk of diabetes, heart attacks, and so forth, but also to protect our mental health and be used as a viable treatment for many of the conditions we've talked about, which is real great progress for the field. But, the World Health Organization have very heavily caveated the guidelines, much in line with what I've said, over the past 10 minutes, recognizing that there are many people, due to a whole raft of reasons, maybe due to, social or home issues, physical health issues, caring responsibilities, mental health issues, struggle or find it difficult to get time or to actually physically do a movement. So for those people who are just not doing much at all, the World Health Organization message is, within the guidelines, just getting started is a really, important difference. Do not worry about how much you do. Just get started, and then as you find time and get into the rhythm and you experience some success and find hopefully a movement you enjoy, then you can start to, progress that, if you wish, in terms of time, in terms of variety, in terms of intensity, and all of those other factors as well. So whilst they've shifted the boundaries about recommendations, they're also recognizing that most people have a lot of, challenges that make it difficult to do movement. And they're also saying for these people, there's probably the biggest bang for the buck in helping those people become more active too. Yeah. So if you're one of the many people who find that number scary, so do I. Welcome. Don't worry, just getting started today, 5-10 minutes, you can have a meaningful difference in what's going on in your brain, your ability to feel more focused, more attention, feel better. And that is the key message from the guidelines.
I think my mom will like hearing that. And I think for me as a clinician, I think it's important to hear that in terms of how I interact and encourage people. And that the messaging that I give in terms of advice. And I know that you've actually authored a book with Simon Rosenbaum here in Australia. And I don't know if that's based primarily at clinicians or patients, but that is involving exercise-based interventions for mental illness. Is there any, firstly, where could we access a copy of that? And what are you've maybe already alluded to some of the pearls in there, but the other key content?
Sure. So I think Simon and Simon, or Dr. Rosenbaum, is an exercise physiologist who's worked lots in Australia at various mental health facilities, and now is doing a lot of work in displaced communities and in terms of using the power of sport and exercise in various refugee camps and work. He does like amazing stuff. And we felt that having accumulated all of this knowledge about the benefits of exercise and mental health, that it was incumbent upon us and relying on our colleagues and contacts to try and distill this information into a tangible format where busy clinicians, students, people who are interested could pick this up and say, what does the evidence on exercise and depression say? What does the evidence on exercise and anxiety say? What does the evidence on exercise and eating disorders say? And talk about each chapter setup. So, what is it set up for each chapter? What is the condition? How may it present? Why may exercise be important for this particular population? What does the research say? And what is the evidence for exercise in this particular condition, and what could be some good parameters to be used in this? So it's predominantly aimed at healthcare professionals, students, fitness trainers, personal trainers, and people who are interested in knowing the evidence and understanding the condition, and want to be able to understand where the state of the evidence is from the latest research papers, and to give that to people who they're working with. And it's important to say that we did have a number of people who've used mental health services as well, contributing to the book as well. So it's not just purely academic. And there's a number of case studies in there, which is talking from various people about how exercise has been structured and used to help various different people with mental health conditions, and also for people who there's interesting chapters about how do I implement exercise in a facility and demonstrate its value and measure the impact of an exercise program in a new hospital setting, for instance. Yeah. So that's a very brief, broad bit about the book.
Fantastic. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. I think many listeners here will find that a really valuable and informative read. Just to go to kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, if you like, I just talked about the dichotomy of people doing more and less through COVID. I'm conscious that, the increment in the recommendations for physical activity for WHO is, a frightening concept for the majority of people. There are a subset who are already doing an awful lot more than that. And I'm conscious as a runner who, does endurance events, that I'm in that group. I'm doing well and more than is recommended. I do that for pleasure. But I'm conscious that there's a risk that you then, because you feel good through exercise, you then use that as a replacement to give you your high. And exercise addiction is a real thing. And when that becomes counterproductive and actually harmful to our physical and mental health, then we are up the other end of the spectrum, and that's a new problem in itself. And I've heard you speak about this, in those early phases where you're using exercise as a tool for your mental well-being, that's probably okay to overshoot in the short term, but certainly longer term that can have significant consequences. I was listening to Rich Roll recently on his podcast, and he has a background that he's very open in sharing with alcohol and drug addiction, and is now an ultra runner. And many people, he says, have approached him and said, you're just replacing one addiction with another. And he has some really, quite sensible and thought-provoking commentary around that. I'm curious to hear your take and any literature, any research, any studies around the area of exercise addiction and, the risks of too much for our mental and physical health.
An excellent PhD finished student recently, Mike Trott, who's published some really interesting papers as part of his PhD. And he's looked at the concept of exercise addiction. Yeah. And that was his whole PhD. Really fascinating. Some great work. So we know in the context of an eating disorder that, a compulsion or a necessity to exercise and to view exercise as a must is a core part of that illness. And that's a small portion of people, but it has a substantial burden. So I'm not going to talk about that, but that's needless to say that this is a very specialist needs population. A great care and attention needs to be given around that particular population. So I'm going to talk about exercise addiction in people who don't have an eating disorder, which is the majority of people who fit into this category. And what Mike found in his PhD research, and he's published a number of papers, if you look on PubMed or search Mike Trott on Google, is that exercise addiction in regular gym goers, and I'm not talking about elite athletes here, I'm not talking about people training for events. So if you go to like a regular gym, or if you go to like a regular running club, you're going to find around 10 or 20% of people who feel that they have to exercise every day or most days, feel incredibly guilty if they don't, feel that it impacts areas of their lives which they didn't anticipate it impacting. Some people in extreme circumstances, not extreme circumstances, but some circumstances, maybe like family events, or thinking, I'll go to this event because I've got to exercise today and stuff. And it's veering away from, movement should be enjoyable, and it's becoming more of a necessity to people, more of a key identity to people. And I'm sure we've all been to the gym at certain points, and you may go in first thing in the morning and you see a person or a group of people, and you go in at lunch sometime like another day, and they're there, and you go in at the end and they're there, or you go and there's whenever time you go, there's certain people there at all times. And this is a new emerging area of exercise addiction. So it's common, and we need to do much more to understand this particular issue. Around 10 to 20% of people have it, and we know that in this particular population, there's a very fine balance. People use it as a really good coping strategy for people in high stress jobs, people who've got high stress in their life, people who are very high functioning, and it's very, very, very beneficial. But there's some people that can tip over into where it's having impacting their daily routine, their quality of life, their mental health, and it's having the undesired effect. This is in the absence of eating disorders. Yeah. So we're just starting to understand this issue. We're just starting to identify who may be at risk. And then I think the next stage is how to differentiate those people where it is a problem and where it is a coping strategy to help people live better, fulfilled lives and balanced lives, because that's what we want. And for those people who tip over where it is becoming problematic and interfering with their ability to live, it's a neglected population. And it's we need to do more to identify those people who may overtrain, may have an injury, and may continue to train. And we need to do much more to help these people for their physical, mental health, and also to rediscover the joys of and the magic of movement.
Magic of movement. I love that. That's going to be my take-home phrase. And you've mentioned new and emerging areas. I know that you're going in a slightly different direction. I know you have a PhD in pain management, and I think your new research is going to involve movement and pain management and mental well-being. Is there any particular area that you want to focus on moving forward with your research?
Yeah, so my broad areas of interest are the relationship between the mind and the body and the power of movement to help make us feel better. So just on what we've spoken about, there's a few interesting projects which I'm really excited about, which I'll mention first. I know we're running out of time, but one is with Professor John Crine and Sandrine Thurnett and colleagues to look at people who are starting to worry about their memory, working age towards older adults, who do not have any objective deficit. So they don't have mild cognitive impairment, they don't have dementia, they're starting to worry about the memory. But if you do a test or you do an MRI, there's no deficits. And we want to understand at that point, can we deliver exercise to make these people, memories better, attention better? And can we explain that by the gut microbiome? And that is a new grant that's started this month, and we're doing a randomised controlled trial, and we're combining that with lab work, which I think is really, really exciting. So I'm really excited to be moving into this particular area, the gut microbiome, and how that may influence cognitive and mental health in the context of exercise. I haven't talked about the studies we've done in China. We've looked at this briefly, and I won't go over that now, but I think that's really exciting. So watch out for that study.
Yeah.
The other area is my sort of area of passion. We've got a new program grant where we're helping people with severe and enduring mental ill health who are often isolated, find it very difficult for a whole number of reasons to join a run club, go to the gym. And I don't mean that in a stigmatising way whatsoever, but there's numerous barriers for people with schizophrenia, psychotic disorders to go. So we're co-developing an intervention to help people in a very large randomised controlled trial to be more active, feel a sense of connection, and all of the things which I take for granted and are available to me to help these isolated people. And that's a new project which we're starting again this month, and that's going to be a 6-year program. And the other area, which is a fellowship, which is I'm going to be doing, is trying to understand the really complex area between feelings of pain and mental ill health, and which is the chicken, which is the egg, what comes first, what happens when you have pain and you also have bad mental health, how does this impact your life, your ability to work, function in life, and ultimately use all of this information to work with people who have mental health and long-term pain issues to help people to move more, because we know in the context of pain more broadly that if you look at the benefits of helping people move, structured exercise, that pain is just as good as many of the common frontline medications which we use for long-term persistent pain. Obviously not acute pain for a pronounced injury if someone's had a horrible injury, but for people who have longer-term pain, we're going to develop an intervention for people who are also struggling with their mental health. And these people generally, from talking to lots of people to build up to this fellowship, struggle to access mainstream pain management services. If you're feeling depressed, anxious, worried, it's difficult to open letters, difficult to answer calls to a number we don't recognise, getting to appointments, and certainly in the UK system, if you don't go to your appointment, you don't go to two, you're sort of discharged. So inadvertently, these people do not get the help that are overrepresented. So we're going to develop an intervention for this group and try and help people with pain and mental health comorbidities, which are individually both the leading, some of the leading causes of, years lived with disability and what messes up with people's lives, and help this neglected but common condition.
It probably won't be surprising to you that I see a large proportion of that population in the emergency department in crisis. So I am very interested in that research because I think it's terribly important. So yeah, it's very exciting. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoy listening to you. I think your work is so interesting, and I'm really excited to follow the next chapter. I'm also very conscious we're running out of time, and I wonder if you've just a few more minutes for a couple of questions, more personal questions for you, based on some of the things we've been discussing.
I've got time for 2 quick questions about me. Yeah, this will be the least interesting part.
So firstly, you're so well read, researched, and I'm conscious that you have your own book that we'll definitely put on the book list for the podcast. But is there anything else that you have read that around this topic that you think is powerful, that maybe even more accessible to our listeners than some of the literature if they don't want to dive into that, although I know many of them will be wanting to? Any recommendations for the book list?
Yeah, great point. I think if it's specifically on this particular topic, I like The Joy of Movement by Kelly. I think that's great, and I really like what she's doing, which I think is fantastic. So that would be, I think, my main book recommendation within this particular area, which I'd recommend for people to access that there are, and I would just say this is not just a general thing, there are lots of people who are writing things out there, but this is just generally, but a lot of it is not all based on science. So just be careful and discerning about what you read.
Can you please write The Magic of Movement, the follow-up?
The Magic of Movement.
I think
I've long thought about writing The Magic of Movement. I've long thought about it, but I just haven't done it yet.
Maybe you have to replicate yourself.
Yes.
But on a more serious note, I completely agree with you, Brendon, and I think that's why it's such an honour, and a privilege to have someone like yourself to speak to on this podcast. And I think why it was quite important that I wanted to ask you to come on, because you do come from this academic background. You're doing really rigorous research and trying to find the best quality of information and evidence out there. And we know there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I know there's also a lot of art to what we do in clinical practice. And it's hard to find quality evidence and information, particularly when it comes to lifestyle as an intervention or as an adjunctive treatment. So I think if it's hard for us as clinicians to find the best evidence, then you can imagine how difficult it is for the public. And we have an important role in translating that message. So I think by having people like yourself and Adrienne speak to us in this space, we're helping to share quality information and ideas. And, you're both working internationally to form collaborative tools and guidelines to help us. So thank you. Finally, what does wellbeing mean to you? And, what's in your own self-care toolbox for times when you are challenged mentally, physically, emotionally? I'm conscious you're a very busy clinician and researcher, and I'm also conscious you've just been very unwell and are currently on, building yourself back up to, work and play. So tell me, what strategies have you been employing through this period?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really important point. So for me, I can be the most enormous hypocrite in terms of movement and well-being. I can sit on particularly in moments like this and sit on meetings all day and talk about the benefits of movement, and inadvertently, or just well-being and looking after myself, and be on calls from morning till night and not looking after myself. So I've learned the hard way, and that's the best. I always learn the hard way. When things go really smooth sailing for me, I learn very little. I learn very little from getting things right, and when things go off kilter and I don't feel great physically or mentally, that's when I think, gosh, I need to slow down. I need to put boundaries in. I need to prioritize things. So I would say that, I've had various life instances like most people have quite recently, and various things that have come up to me that have really brought me to a place of where I have to prioritize my health and well-being and putting in boundaries around the amount of time that I'm doing and working. And for me, that's been really important. So I'm just actually recovering from pneumonia as well, which has been quite interesting for me and difficult, because I left hospital. I was in hospital with pneumonia, and previously I was very active and cycling and cycling 100 miles a week to work and going to the gym, and I came out of hospital, I could walk 5 minutes, and then I was absolutely exhausted. So I've had to slowly build up and slowly sort of reawaken my brain. And for me now, as I'm coming into a period of recovery from this physical health condition, which has obviously impacted my mental well-being, I've had to sort of, completely reassess everything that I'm doing, and completely prioritize my own well-being in terms of, this morning, I made sure I got a good time. I made sure I, went for a brief run. I didn't try and run and do any great records. Obviously, maybe about 8 weeks after having pneumonia, so I'm not really sprinting. And that's been really important for me. But in ordinary times, what keeps me emotionally and spiritually balanced, as I would say, is starting off the day. For me personally, a few things that help me is reflecting on a gratitude list that I've written the night before. I read every morning a piece of inspirational literature. something which will inspire me. I will, throughout the course of the day, I will try and give one or two people a call, nothing to do with work, and who I know are just having a bit of a difficult time, or just check in with people who've not heard from them for a long time. Because my natural inclination before all of this is to wake up inadvertently and just think about, as I'm going, I can think today I've got to do X, I've got to do Y, I've got to do all of these things. And it's all just, even I'm going to work and working as a clinician still, and I'm doing work which you can say is helping people. I'm thinking about all of this stuff, and I'm not thinking about what can I give to others, which is not related to work. So that helps me to be of use to other people, and to sort of help keep me level-headed and grounded. And then if at the end of the day, another little tip that helps me, and I've done for quite a number of years, is I diary every sort of day what I do. And it's nice having like a 5-year diary at the moment. It's the longest I've found, and just seeing what I did this day 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and how I was doing. And I have a concurrent sort of gratitude diary where I write 10 things I'm very grateful for. And that shifts me, as I settle down for the end of the night and have a bit of quiet time, and I listen to some relaxing music, to a position of being grateful. Because I am really grateful for everything I've got in my life. I've got an amazing life. I've got absolutely everything I need. It's, a life of wonderful abundance. But if I'm not careful, just my natural inclination, I can start to drift into worry, or I can start to drift into, I wish I had X or Y, and I don't need X, Y, I've got everything I need. So for me, ending the day in a period of gratitude, silence, and appreciation, and then waking up and rereading this, reading some inspirational literature, helps to keep me emotionally balanced.
Yeah, perfect. Can't think of a better way to end on. And, you're talking about gratitude, and I'm sitting thinking how grateful I am that you have given up your precious time to talk to us today. I think your work is powerful. I think it's very important, and I'm looking forward to following the journey over the next couple of years. Keep up the great work. Thank you, Brendon.
No, thank you, Cheryl. Really appreciate it. It was great talking.
I was admiring your beautiful sunny run in London this morning on social media. My aunt lives down in London, and I cannot wait to get back there. Hopefully next year we'll see us borders and opening and us able to travel.
That would be good. I really want to come back to Australia, because last time I went it was December 2019, and I went to Brisbane, but I only went for 3 nights and gave 2 talks, and it was a bit much.
I know you'd be welcome back here with open arms, so hopefully we'll both be able to make those international trips, maybe 2022.
I'd love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cheryl. Thanks for all the great work you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Beautiful. You've just been listening to Dr. Brendon Stubbs. I hope you enjoyed the show and this conversation as much as I did. Now, there was quite a lot of information and literature referenced in this conversation. I will put a link to Brendon's academic website where you can find links to many of the papers discussed here. But I've also put a link to his social media pages. He can be found on Twitter and Instagram, where he does share a lot of the interesting research that he is doing and others that he works with. And I think there's always some very interesting commentary around that, and I find it a very accessible format. I'll also put a link to the book that we discussed here that he co-authored with Dr. Simon Rosenbaum on exercise-based interventions for mental health. That, as he discussed, is open to anyone interested, so clinicians, people working in fitness, and people who are with an interest in this topic. I will also put a link to subscribe to the podcast. As I've mentioned, the past couple of episodes, would love some feedback. If you could take some time to rate, review, subscribe, and share if you feel that this is valuable. I am really grateful to experts coming on to impart some of their knowledge and the great work that they're doing. And I think the translation of research is so important, and getting the message from people like Brendon and Adrienne to practicing clinicians is really important and useful. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.
The key thing for any long-term behaviour change is finding something you enjoy, you find pleasure in. And in many ways, for people who struggle to find a movement they enjoy or don't find it difficult, or may struggle for mental health reasons or physical health reasons, because it's painful or it's difficult or it's challenging, disguising that in a way so it doesn't really feel like exercising, or sort of, walking and talking and socialising and not really thinking about movement is a really good way.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.